The article was called something like, "Scientists Revive 48,500-year-old Zombie Virus from Siberian Permafrost." I remember the exact number because it struck me as the kind of specificity that journalists reach for when they want you to feel the weight of something without actually understanding it. 48,500 years. Not 48,000. Not 50,000. 48,500, as if someone had sat down and counted. I read the headline twice. Then I read the subheading, which said the French research team had extracted the organism from a frozen lake bed in Yakutia and successfully reactivated it in a controlled laboratory environment. I sat with that for a moment. Successfully reactivated, doing a lot of heavy lifting in a sentence that was trying very hard not to sound alarming. Then I closed the tab. That's what I did. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. I read it. I decided it was sensationalist science journalism, doing exactly what sensationalist science journalism does. And I closed the tab. It wasn't a difficult decision. I've been at Nibio long enough to have a working sense of the distance between a headline and a finding. And that headline had the particular breathlessness of something that had been written to be shared, rather than understood. So I closed it. Outside the window, the Barents Sea was doing what it does in January, which is mostly being black water and white ice in the dark below you, scrolling past at whatever altitude a short-haul regional flight operates at. I don't know planes. I know soil samples and moisture gradients and the way permafrost behaves when you introduce heat to it, slowly versus all at once. Planes are not my area. But I know what the archipelago looks like from above in winter, and it looks like something that was never meant to be lived in, which is sort of the point of the whole enterprise I was flying up to assess. The flight from Tromsø to Longyearbyen is 40 minutes on a good day. 40 minutes is not enough time to read anything substantial, not enough time to sleep, and barely enough time to get settled before you're being told to prepare for descent. I'd taken it 3 times before for other work, and each time I'd made the same mistake of thinking I'd use the time productively. This time, I'd at least had the sense to bring the tablet, even if what I'd ended up reading was zombie virus journalism before thinking better of it. I watched the ice instead. It was a cleaner way to spend the time. Catherine Garrison was waiting outside the terminal when I came through. She was standing next to a Stats Big truck, the kind of practical battered thing that institutional logistics departments run into the ground over a decade and then run into the ground again. And she had her hands in her jacket pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold. It was -19. I know that because I checked before boarding and had added a thermal layer specifically for the walk between the terminal and whatever transport was picking me up. Small professional habit. You check the conditions before you arrive somewhere, not after. She introduced herself and shook my hand with a firm, brief grip. Straight blonde hair pulled back under a Stats Big branded cap, pale complexion, the kind of composed face that doesn't give you much to read. She had the manner of someone who had briefed a lot of people who were coming from somewhere warmer and didn't entirely understand what they were coming to see. "Nolan Vega," I said. "Nibio." "I know," she said, and got in the truck. The drive to Plateberget takes about 10 minutes, depending on conditions. Catherine spent most of it explaining the situation in the measured, practiced way of someone who has told the same story enough times that the story has found its own shape. 6 weeks ago, accelerated permafrost thaw had opened a crack in the bedrock of the innermost chamber, 4 meters in length, running roughly northwest to southeast along a pre-existing geological seam. Stats Big's structural team had done an initial assessment and flagged it for follow-up. The concern, she explained, was not immediate structural failure. The mountain was not going anywhere, but the integrity of the atmospheric conditions in the inner chamber and the potential for moisture infiltration into the seed storage areas. "And the media concern," I said. She glanced at me. "Stats Big wants the assessment completed before it becomes a story, yes." That was the honest version of what she'd been working around saying, and I appreciated that she said it plainly when I gave the opening. The vault had already had one media cycle when water infiltrated the outer tunnel back in 2017. Nobody wanted another one. The 4-meter crack in the innermost chamber of the world's most important seed repository was the kind of detail that writes its own headlines, and the preference was to have a professional containment assessment in hand before anyone started writing them. I understood that. It was a reasonable institutional concern, and I'd been brought in to address it, not to have opinions about it. So I listened, took it at face value, and watched the mountain come up through the windscreen as we got closer. Platoberget in January is a dark shape against a dark sky. The entrance to the vault is a concrete wedge jutting out of the mountainside, functional and deliberately understated, lit by a strip of lights that make it look like something between an industrial facility and a piece of public art. I'd seen photographs. The photographs don't do much to prepare you for the actual scale of it, or for the particular quality of quiet that sits around it, the way sound behaves differently when there's that much rock and ice absorbing it. Catherine pulled up and cut the engine. "The crack is in the innermost chamber," she said. "I'll take you through the full walkthrough tomorrow morning. Tonight I just want you to see the site layout and the access points." "That works," I said. She got out of the truck. I got out of the truck. The cold came in immediately, the kind that doesn't feel like temperature so much as pressure, and I pulled my collar up and followed her toward the entrance. Nothing about the drive had suggested I should read the situation any other way than she presented it. A structural problem, a bureaucratic concern about optics, a professional assessment to be delivered and filed. That was the job. I'd done versions of it a dozen times in different contexts. Soil contamination reviews, drainage assessments. One memorable week in a Trondheim grain facility that had developed a moisture problem nobody wanted to admit was as serious as it was. This felt like that, a thing that needed looking at by someone whose job was looking at things. I followed Catherine Garrison into Platoberget Mountain and didn't think again about the article I'd closed somewhere over the Barents Sea. The outer tunnel was longer than I'd expected. That's the first thing. You approach Platoberget from the outside and the mountain looks like a mountain. Rock and snow and the kind of indifference that geography has toward people. And then you're inside it, and the scale shifts in a way that takes a moment to recalibrate. The tunnel ran maybe 130 meters from the entrance portal to the first set of doors. Concrete walls, overhead lighting on a strip that buzzed faintly at a frequency you stopped noticing after a minute or so. Cold, but a different cold than outside. Managed. The kind of cold that's been decided on rather than arrived at naturally. Catherine moved through it the way people move through their own kitchens. Not fast, not performing anything, just present in a space she understood completely. She pointed things out as we went. Drainage channels along the base of the walls, the ventilation inlets, a monitoring panel mounted at chest height with a readout I didn't look at closely because she was already past it and talking about the secondary door seals. I kept up and took notes on the tablet and tried to get a working picture of the place in my head. The airlock was about 2/3 of the way down. A proper one, not the kind you see in older agricultural storage where someone's bolted a rubber seal around a steel door and called it done. This was purpose-built, substantial. A chamber with 2 sets of doors and enough space between them to fit 4 or 5 people standing without touching. Catherine stopped at the inner wall of the airlock and pointed to a panel I hadn't noticed at first because it was mounted slightly recessed, painted the same gray as everything else. About the size of a large laptop. A red handle on the left side, a keypad in the middle, a lever on the right. "Emergency atmospheric seal," she said. "Installed in 2015 after the flooding incident." She said flooding incident like I'd know what she meant. I didn't. But I didn't ask because it didn't seem relevant to the crack assessment and I had enough to track already. She walked me through the sequence the way you'd explain how to use a coffee machine to a house guest. Red handle first, pull it down. Keypad, 7741. She said the numbers individually, not as a code, just as numbers. then the lever, rotate it 180 degrees clockwise. She demonstrated each step without actually engaging anything, her hands moving through the motions a few centimeters from the panel. "If it goes off accidentally," she said, "or intentionally without prior coordination, StatsBig needs a minimum of 6 weeks to cut through from the outside. The seal is rated for full atmospheric isolation. It's not something you undo quickly." She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Informational. Slightly bored, in the way that experts get slightly bored with the parts of their expertise that feel obvious to them. I wrote it down. Airlock seal, 2015, 6 weeks external access minimum. And then we moved through the second set of doors and into the inner sections of the vault. I'm not going to pretend I was thinking about that panel when we walked away from it. I wasn't. It went into the same mental folder as the drainage channels and the ventilation inlets, background infrastructure noted and filed. That's the honest accounting of it. The smell hit me maybe 10 steps past the second door. Not immediately, not like walking into something, more like becoming aware that the air had a quality to it that the tunnel air hadn't had. Sweet, organic. The closest thing I could compare it to at the time was a bag of apples left in a warm car for too long. That fermented fruit edge that's not quite rot but is heading somewhere in that direction. Distinct enough that I stopped walking for half a second before I caught myself. "There's a smell," I said. Brilliant observation. That's my way of saying I didn't have a better opening for it. Catherine glanced back at me. "The crack," she said. "Condensation from the temperature differential interacting with the packaging materials on the nearest shelves. We've been monitoring it. It's within acceptable parameters." She kept walking. I stood there another second or two, breathing it in. Sweet and warm and somehow wrong for a place that was supposed to be cold and inert and sealed against exactly this kind of atmospheric irregularity. But Catherine had already moved on and was explaining something about the monitoring station setup, and I had 20 minutes of time in this facility against her 3 years of it, and the explanation she'd given was plausible. Condensation off a bedrock crack, interacting with seed packaging. I'd seen moisture do strange things in enclosed agricultural storage before. The Trondheim facility had developed a smell too, early on, before anyone admitted the moisture problem was as bad as it was. Smells happen in enclosed spaces. They're not always indicators of something catastrophic. I started walking again and caught up to her. What I know now, and didn't know then, is that I made a decision in that moment that I dressed up as professional deference, but was actually just easier. Catherine knew the space. Catherine had the credentials and the tenure and the working knowledge of every variable I was only beginning to map. Accepting her explanation cost me nothing in the short term and let me get on with the job. That's the honest version. I wasn't being rigorous. I was being comfortable. She led me further in toward the sample shelves. The vault opened up here. 3 separate chambers. The innermost one still ahead, but the intermediate space already substantial. Row after row of sealed black boxes on metal shelving, each one labeled in a system I didn't need to understand to recognize as meticulous. The scale of it lands differently in person than in the briefing documents. 1.3 million samples. Every agricultural crop humanity had figured out how to cultivate. Backed up against exactly the kind of catastrophe that makes backup copies necessary. Standing in the middle of it felt like standing in a library that had been built for a reader who hadn't arrived yet. The smell was still there. Faint now, or maybe I'd adjusted to it. I wasn't sure which. Catherine was already at the monitoring station on the far wall, pulling up readings on the console, and I went to join her and we got to work. She walked me through the sensor array, the temperature logs, the humidity data from the past 6 weeks since the crack had opened. I asked questions. She answered them. The data looked like what she'd described on the drive. A thermal anomaly in the innermost chamber, a slow and ongoing process. Nothing that had yet reached the sample shelves. The crack itself I wouldn't see until the full walkthrough the next morning. I took notes. I asked follow-up questions. I did the job I was there to do. The sweet smell sat in the back of my awareness the whole time, not demanding anything, not insisting on itself, just there. I'd accepted the explanation for it and moved on, and that explanation was now part of my working model of the facility, the same as the drainage channels and the airlock seal and the 6-week timeline for external access. Background, filed, settled. I didn't revisit it. There was no reason to revisit it. Catherine had been managing this place for 3 years, and she'd explained it without hesitation, and I had a structural assessment to conduct, and a report to file, and a flight back to Oslo eventually. And the smell was condensation off a permafrost crack interacting with seed packaging, and that was that. That was that. The voicemail notification was there when I woke up. 2:14 a.m. Maybe. I'd rolled over for some reason, dry air or the unfamiliar mattress or just the way sleep works at that latitude when the dark is total and permanent and your body loses track of what time is supposed to feel like. The phone screen lit the ceiling. One notification. Catherine Garrison, 1:47 a.m. I lay there for a second looking at it. People call in the middle of the night for a handful of reasons, and most of them are bad, so I sat up and played it. 11 seconds of nothing. Not breathing, not wind, not the ambient hum of equipment. Just silence, the flat digital kind that means the line is open and someone is holding a phone and not speaking. Then Catherine's voice, and this is the part I've turned over more times than I can count. Because the voice was hers, but the delivery wasn't. No inflection, no uptick at the end of numbers the way people naturally do when they're reading something aloud. Just coordinates, rattled off in sequence. Latitude, longitude, depth notation. Then the call ended. That was it. No. Sorry for the late call. No. I'll explain in the morning. Nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in my hand and the room very dark and very quiet, and I thought, and this is honest, I thought she'd probably pocket dialed me or sleepwalked to her phone, or was running some kind of night check on the monitoring equipment and had grabbed the wrong contact. I thought about the GPS data she'd shown me during the initial walkthrough, all those readouts on the monitoring stations, and I told myself she'd been reading something off a screen and called me by accident while doing it. People do strange things at 2 in the morning. I've done strange things at 2 in the morning. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back down. I didn't sleep well. That's not a dramatic statement, it's just what happened. I lay there for a while in that half state where your thoughts run but don't connect. And eventually something that was close enough to sleep came and took the rest of the night. I mapped the coordinates before breakfast. That's my way of saying I sat on the edge of the bed again at 6:40 something a.m. with the phone and a cup of instant coffee from the kettle on the dresser. And I pulled up a geological reference tool I use for field work. Nothing fancy, just a mapping application with subsurface layer data. And I typed in what Catherine had read. The coordinates resolved, 200 meters below the vault's inner chamber, solid bedrock. No mapped cavity, no known geological feature, nothing that any survey or geological record indicated should be there. Not a drainage channel, not a natural void, not anything. I looked at it for a while, drank the coffee, looked at it again. The thing about working in environmental assessment, and I've been doing this long enough that it's become a kind of reflex, is that you develop a specific relationship with data that doesn't fit. You don't panic about it, but you don't dismiss it either. You hold it at arm's length and you ask what would have to be true for this to be accurate. And you ask what would have to be true for this to be wrong, and usually one of those answers is much longer than the other. The shorter answer is usually right. I couldn't figure out a short answer for why Catherine Garrison would call me at 1:47 in the morning and read me GPS coordinates pointing to a location 200 meters below the vault in featureless bedrock. I had no framework for it. Not yet. I wrote the coordinates down in my field notebook. Not on my tablet, not in the inspection log. In the paper notebook I carry in my jacket pocket. The one I use for things I'm not sure how to categorize yet. Then I got dressed and went down for breakfast and told myself I'd raise it with Catherine when I saw her and see what she said. She was already at the site when I arrived, standing outside the tunnel entrance in her gear, checking something on her tablet, and she looked fine. That's the word I keep coming back to. She looked fine, alert, professional. The same Catherine who'd walked me through the airlock sequence the day before with that easy competence she had. The kind that comes from 3 years of knowing a place better than anyone else does. I waited until we were inside, past the outer tunnel, before I brought it up. We were reviewing monitoring data from the overnight period, and I mentioned, as casually as I could manage, that I'd gotten her call. She looked at me. What call? 1:47 this morning. You left a voicemail. Something crossed her face. Not guilt, not embarrassment. More like confusion, genuine and brief. And then it settled back into neutral. I don't remember calling you, she said. I was asleep by 11. I played her the voicemail. She listened to it with her head slightly tilted and her expression doing nothing I could read. And when it ended, she said, "That's strange," in a tone that suggested it was mildly strange. The way a wrong coffee order is strange. Not the way hearing your own voice read coordinates to a point in solid bedrock at 2 in the morning is strange. I let it sit for a moment. Then I told her I'd mapped the coordinates. She set her tablet down on the monitoring station desk and looked at me directly. And they resolved to a point 200 meters below this chamber, in bedrock. There's no geological record of any feature at that location. She was quiet for a few seconds. Coordinates from what source? The overnight monitoring logs pull from multiple sensors. There can be data artifacts when the system's running thermal compensation cycles. It's a known issue. That was a reasonable explanation. I noted it. I also noted that it was the second reasonable explanation I'd received in 2 days for something that had made me uneasy, and both of them had come from the same person. I told her I was considering calling Nibio's Oslo office. Not to escalate anything, I said. Just a second opinion on the crack assessment given the new information. Standard practice for anything that produced anomalous data. I kept my voice even. I was trying to make it sound like the obvious next step, which it was. Her reaction was immediate. Statsbag has been very clear about this, she said. Internal assessment, no outside involvement. The moment Oslo gets a call about anomalous data at this facility, we're looking at a press inquiry within 48 hours. That's not speculation. That's how it's worked before. She picked her tablet back up. The monitoring artifact issue is documented. I'll pull the maintenance log and send it to you this afternoon. She said it with the certainty of someone who has managed institutional relationships for a long time and knows exactly where the lines are. Bureaucratic self-protection. I've seen it in every government-adjacent organization I've ever worked with. The reflex to keep problems internal until they can be shaped into something presentable. The anxiety about external attention arriving before external answers do. It's frustrating, but it's not unusual. It's not even unreasonable, from a certain angle. I said fine. I said I'd wait for the maintenance log. I didn't call Oslo. I've thought about that moment more than any other single moment in this whole thing. Not because the decision was complicated. It wasn't. It felt simple. It felt like deferring to someone who knew the institutional landscape better than I did. But because of what that simplicity cost. Catherine had been inside that vault for 3 years. She'd been inside the inner chamber without a mask for, well, I didn't know yet how long. Didn't know yet what that meant. Everything she'd told me since the airport was part of my working model of the situation. The smell, the safety of the inner chambers, the coordinates being a data artifact. All of it filtered through her, and I'd taken it in and filed it and built on top of it. I had no framework yet to see that as a problem. That's the honest truth of it. Standing there in the outer tunnel with the monitoring stations humming, and Catherine already back to reviewing overnight data, I had no reason to see it as anything except a reasonable professional boundary being drawn by the person responsible for the facility. So I let it go. I opened my field notebook and got back to work. 41 hours in, I found the notebook. It was sitting open on the desk at monitoring station 3. Not tucked away, not set aside, just open, like she'd stepped back from it mid-sentence. I almost didn't look. I was pulling overnight humidity readings off the adjacent terminal, and the notebook was just there in my peripheral vision, and I'd have ignored it entirely, except the handwriting caught me. Something about the way the page looked. Dense, crowded, not the kind of notes you take when you're logging observations. I set my tablet down and looked properly. The first page of what I was seeing, I'd find out later it was page 47, that the earlier pages were normal field notes, environmental readings, structural observations, the kind of thing you'd expect. The first page I saw had the same sentence written across it, line after line, filling the ruled space completely. It was here before the seeds. It has been eating the silence. Neat handwriting at the top. Controlled, evenly spaced. The kind of hand that's been trained to record data legibly. By the middle of the page, it was starting to compress. The letters getting smaller and closer together, like she was trying to fit more in. By the bottom, the sentence was still recognizable, but only just. I turned the page. Same sentence. Already deteriorating faster this time, starting compressed and getting worse. I turned through all 12 pages, standing there at the monitoring desk. I don't know why I turned through all 12. I knew what I was going to find after the second one, knew it after the first one, really. But I kept going. I think I needed to see how far it went. The last page was barely legible. The sentence was still there if you knew what you were looking for, but the individual letters had lost their shapes. It looked less like handwriting and more like pressure marks, like someone dragging a pen across paper without quite seeing it anymore. I set the notebook down exactly where I'd found it, didn't close it. My hands were steady. That's the thing about field work. You get trained out of visible reactions, or you train yourself out of them. Or maybe the work just selects for people who don't have many. I stood there with the humidity readings I'd come to pull still open on the terminal beside me, and I thought, she's been here 3 years. That's the thought that came first, not, what does this mean, or what do I do? Just that flat biographical fact. 3 years. And then, she was the one who told me the smell was condensation. I pulled up the internal camera system. The vault's monitoring setup isn't complicated. Fixed cameras at the entrance, the airlock, the main corridor, and 4 coverage points inside the inner chamber itself. StatsBug installed them after the 2017 flooding incident, which Catherine had mentioned during the walkthrough as context for some of the newer infrastructure. The footage archives automatically to a local server and keeps 60 days. I knew this because Catherine had told me. I was aware, pulling up the interface, that I was using a system I understood entirely through her. I went back 6 weeks, the date the crack first appeared. I'm not going to walk through all of it because most of it was normal. Catherine moving through the vault on her rounds, checking equipment, logging readings, doing the work of managing a facility that holds 1.3 million seed samples and temperatures that have to stay precisely controlled. She knew what she was doing. That was never in question. What I was looking for, I found on day 9 after the crack appeared. And once I found it, I went back through the prior 8 days more carefully and found traces of it earlier, smaller, easier to miss. Row 7C, sample shelf on the east wall of the inner chamber, 3rd section from the back. The wall behind it is where the crack first opened. The first session was 40 minutes. I almost flagged it as nothing. A supervisor standing near a structural concern, monitoring it, which is exactly what she should have been doing. Except she wasn't monitoring it. She was facing the wall, not examining it, not taking readings, not documenting anything, just standing there. I scrubbed through the footage and her position didn't change. Her head didn't move. At the 40-minute mark, she turned and walked out of the chamber at a normal pace like she was finishing a task. The second session was 63 minutes. I found it 4 days later in the archive. The third was 91 minutes. That one was from 11 days ago, which meant it had happened before I'd landed in Longyearbyen. Before Catherine had met me at the airport in the Stats big truck and briefed me on the drive with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. Before she'd walked me through the airlock and explained the seal panel almost as a joke. Before she told me the smell was condensation. I sat down. There's a rolling stool at monitoring station 3, and I pulled it over and sat on it because I needed to not be standing. Here's what I was working out, sitting there. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a medical professional, I'm a field assessment specialist with a background in environmental containment, and I was trying to apply that framework to something it wasn't designed for. What I had was a pattern of behavior in the footage that didn't have a normal explanation. A notebook with 12 pages of deteriorating repetition, and a data point I'd been carrying since day one. The smell, sweet and organic, like fermentation, that I had accepted as explained and filed away and built on top of. The explanation had come from someone who was, at the time she gave it, already spending 91 minutes standing motionless in front of a crack in permafrost. I didn't have a scientific framework for what that meant. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't sitting there constructing a theory. I wasn't running through mechanisms or pathways or anything organized. What I was doing was something more like the opposite of that. I was taking apart the model of the situation I'd been building for 41 hours and looking at which pieces of it had come from Catherine. And the answer was, most of them. The smell. The assessment of the inner chamber as safe for unmasked entry during brief visits. The coordinates being a data artifact. The decision to keep Oslo out. Every load-bearing piece of my working understanding of what was happening in this vault had been handed to me by the same source. And the footage on the screen in front of me was telling me that source had been compromised. I didn't have another word for it. Compromised was the closest I could get. For longer than I'd been on the island. The camera feed was still running. Live view, inner chamber. Row 7C was empty. Catherine was somewhere else in the facility, doing something I couldn't currently see. I looked at the notebook, still open to that last page. The sentence still there in marks that barely held their shape. The monitoring station had a satellite uplink terminal I'd clocked on day 1 and never touched. I crossed to it now and pulled up the interface while I still had momentum, because if I stopped moving, I was going to start thinking too carefully about what I was doing. And if I started thinking too carefully, I was going to talk myself out of it the same way I'd talked myself out of calling Oslo 40 hours ago. I wasn't going to do that again. The Nibio emergency line rang twice. A man's voice, brisk and alert in a way that told me he'd been awake for a while already or was the kind of person who answered crisis lines like he was answering a normal call. Salinas. This is Nolan Vega, Nibio field assessor, currently on site at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. I need to report an anomalous biological growth in the innermost chamber and request specialist consultation. A pause. Not long. Maybe 3 seconds. What kind of growth? Fungal, I think. I don't have the taxonomy. That's why I need the specialist. Another pause. Shorter. Hold. He put me on hold without waiting for a response. I didn't mind. I used the time to get the photographs queued for uplink. I'd taken them earlier that afternoon when I'd gone back into the inner chamber for measurements. and at the time I told myself I was being thorough, doing my job. What I'd actually been doing, I think, was documenting something I didn't have words for yet. The growth in the crack was a particular color, not quite white, not quite gray. More like the color of old bone left in a wet place. It had a texture to it, dense and matted close to the wall, then finer at the edges, the way frost forms on a window, except it wasn't frost. And it wasn't growing outward from a cold surface, it was growing inward from the crack toward the chamber, toward the shelving, toward row 7C specifically, which was either meaningful or wasn't, and I'd stopped giving myself permission to assume things weren't meaningful. Salinas came back. I'm patching in Dr. Matthews, University of Oslo mycology. Give her everything. A click, a breath, then a woman's voice, careful and measured. Dr. Matthews. Dr. Matthews, my name is Nolan Vega. I'm a field assessor currently inside the Svalbard Seed Vault. I'm uploading photographs to you now through the facility's satellite uplink. You should receive them in about 90 seconds. While they transfer, I'll describe what I'm seeing. Please. I described it. I'd been trained to report observations in plain language without editorializing, which is normally a professional habit, and in that moment felt like the only thing keeping me functional. I told her the color. I told her the texture, the density gradient from the crack outward. I told her the rate of advance. I'd measured it against a reference mark I'd scratched into the wall with my thumbnail that morning, and in 8 hours it had moved approximately 4 centimeters toward the nearest seed shelf. I told her it was growing in an environment that should have been too cold and too dry to support most biological activity. I told her there was a sweet smell in the inner chamber that had been present since I arrived, and that the facility supervisor had attributed to condensation interacting with seed packaging. I stopped there. I didn't tell her about the notebook. I didn't tell her about the footage. I didn't know how to put that part into plain language yet. I have the photographs, Dr. Matthews said. Then nothing. I watched the clock on the uplink terminal. 10 seconds. 20. I looked at the door to the inner chamber, which was closed. 30 seconds. I thought about Catherine somewhere in the facility, doing something I couldn't see. 40 seconds. Dr. Matthews? Yes. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically. She was still careful, still precise, but something underneath it had shifted. I need to ask you some questions about the photographs before I say anything. Go ahead. The coloration at the growth margin. Can you confirm that's accurate, not a lighting artifact? Confirmed. I took several at different angles. The color is consistent. And the structure at the leading edge. Those filamentous extensions. How long approximately? A few millimeters. Maybe 3, maybe 5. Hard to measure without contact. Did you make contact with the growth? No. Did the facility supervisor make contact with it? I didn't answer that immediately. I don't know, I said, which was true. It was also the most frightening true thing I'd said out loud in 2 days. Dr. Matthews went quiet again for a moment, but this was a different kind of quiet. Not the 40-second silence of someone processing a shock, but the shorter silence of someone choosing words. Mr. Vega, what I'm about to tell you is theoretical. I want to be precise about that. The growth pattern in these photographs and the spore morphology visible in the close-range images are consistent with theoretical models for a genus that has never been recovered as a living sample. It's cordyceps adjacent. You may be familiar with the family. In insects, I said. Yes, in insects, the mechanism involves chemically mediating the host's motor decision-making. The organism doesn't exactly control the host. The literature describes it more as redirecting behavioral outputs toward conditions favorable to the organism's sporulation. The host continues to function. The host's movements become purposeful in ways that serve the organism rather than the host. I was looking at the notebook, still open on the desk. The sentence, still there. Dr. Matthews, this genus you're describing, has anyone studied its effect on mammals? No, she said. No one has ever found a living sample. The models are based on preserved spore structures recovered from permafrost cores. Everything I know about its mechanism in mammals is hypothetical. A pause. Mr. Vega, how long has the facility supervisor been working in proximity to this growth? The crack appeared 6 weeks ago, I said. She's been managing the vault for 3 years. Silence on the line. Salinas was still there. I could hear him breathing, or I thought I could. Nobody said anything for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. The photographs show growth that is consistent with an organism capable of surviving in anaerobic permafrost conditions for extended periods. Dr. Matthews said finally. Extended meaning, I want to be precise here, potentially tens of thousands of years. The theoretical models were constructed partly in response to the Siberian permafrost virus recovery. The category of thing is established. Viable ancient organisms are not impossible. I heard myself say no in a quiet, flat way, and I wasn't disagreeing with her. I was just processing. That's the only word I have for it. The article. The one I'd read over the Barents Sea 2 days ago and decided was sensationalist. 48,500 years. Reactivated in a lab. I'd looked out the window at the black water and the white ice and thought, cleaner way to spend 40 minutes. I'd been right that it was sensationalist. I'd been wrong that sensationalist meant untrue. The category of thing the headline was describing, ancient organism, viable, alive after timescales the brain doesn't really process. That category was real. I'd just needed something to confirm it, and I'd found it in a crack in the innermost chamber of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, advancing 4 centimeters every 8 hours toward 1.5 million seed samples, and it had already had access to Catherine Garrison for 6 weeks. 6 weeks minimum, possibly 3 years, depending on what proximity meant in practice. And I didn't know what it meant in practice because the only person who could tell me was Catherine. I stood at the monitoring station with the phone in my hand and did not say any of that out loud. Salinas asked me something. What were my current safety protocols? Something like that. And I answered him on autopilot while I worked through the arithmetic I didn't want to work through. Every piece of information Catherine had given me. Every assessment, every explanation, every redirection. The smell, the safe chambers, the coordinates being a data artifact. Keep Oslo out of it. All of it had come from someone the organism had been shaping for longer than I'd been on the island, and I had no way at all, to know which parts of my working picture of this situation were real and which parts were what the organism needed me to believe. Dr. Matthews was still talking. I made myself listen. There is no established protocol for a living sample scenario, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. What I can tell you is that the growth rate you've described and the proximity to the seed containers represents a significant and escalating contamination risk, and that any personnel who have had prolonged unprotected exposure to the inner chamber environment should be considered. She stopped, started again. Should be assessed. Understood, I said. I thanked her. I thanked Salinas. I ended the call and stood in the monitoring station in the quiet of Plateberget Mountain with the notebook open in front of me and the camera feed running on the screen showing an empty row 7C. And I understood, not from anything Dr. Matthews had said explicitly, but from the whole shape of it, that I had run out of time to be deferential. I went back in. That's the short version. The longer version is that I stood in the monitoring station for probably 3 minutes after the call ended, the notebook still open in front of me, and I had a whole internal conversation with myself about what the responsible course of action was, and whether I should wait for guidance from Salinas, or try to reach the StatsBig site coordinator, or call the Norwegian emergency services number I had written on the inside cover of my own notebook when I landed. And at the end of all of it, I picked up my mask, clipped my radio to my jacket, and walked back into the tunnel toward the inner chamber, because Catherine was in there. That was the whole of it. She was in there and I was out here, and whatever else was true, that part needed to change. The outer tunnel is about 60 meters. I'd walked it a dozen times by then, and I knew the sound of it. The way the cold air sat differently in there than outside. The low mechanical hum from the ventilation running somewhere in the walls. The way my boots on the concrete had a flat, absorbed quality. No echo. Like the mountain was swallowing the sound before it could come back. I noticed all of it, and none of it registered as anything except distance to cover. I had the mask on before I reached the airlock. I'd put it on in the monitoring station, actually, before I even left the room. My hands were steadier than I would have expected. I remember thinking that was probably not a good sign, that some part of me had already moved past the stage where my hands shook. The chamber door has a small reinforced window set into it, about 30 centimeters across, wire-reinforced glass that gives you a narrow slice of whatever is on the other side. I got to the door and looked through before I did anything else. She was there, standing at row 7C, same position I'd seen on the camera footage, facing the wall, not the shelf, her back to the door. No mask. She had a clipboard at her side, but she wasn't writing on it, just holding it, her arm loose. The crack in the back wall was visible from where I stood, a dark line running diagonally up through the permafrost, and there was something at the margins of it. I'd seen it in photographs, but seeing it through the glass was different. The color. It wasn't quite any color I had a clean name for, not black, not green. Something between the two that had no business being in a seed vault or anywhere else I'd ever been. I knocked on the door. Not loud. I wasn't sure why I wasn't loud. Some instinct I didn't examine. I knocked again, harder. Catherine. My voice came out flat through the mask. Catherine, I need you to come to the door. She turned. That part I've thought about more than I can explain. The way she turned. It was a complete movement, unhurried, like someone responding to their name being called from across a room at a party. That kind of ordinary, untroubled pivot. She looked at the door and her face was perfectly calm. No surprise at seeing me there. No recognition of anything wrong with the situation. She just looked at me through the glass, and then she said the coordinates. I couldn't hear her through the door. The chamber ceiling is too good for that. But I could read them. I had listened to that voicemail enough times by then that I knew the sequence. She said every number in the same order, in the same flat, evenly spaced way she'd said them at 1:47 in the morning, when she'd called me from wherever she'd been standing. And I watched her mouth move through the wire-reinforced glass and felt something drop out of my chest. Then she turned back toward the wall, not toward me, toward the crack. I stood at the door, and I did not open it. I want to be honest about that moment because it's the one I've gone back to the most. I could have opened the door. I had clearance, I knew the handle. There was nothing physically stopping me. And I stood there with my hand not quite touching the latch, and I ran the numbers instead, which is what I do when I'm frightened, and I don't want to admit I'm frightened. I go clinical. I make a list. I find the shape of the problem in terms I can report rather than terms I have to feel. Here is what the list looked like. Catherine had been inside the inner chamber that day for at least 40 minutes without respiratory protection, and that was only what I could confirm from the camera logs I'd checked before the call. The notebook entries, the sentence written over and over in handwriting that fell apart across 12 pages. Those went back further. Days before I had landed. Days before I had arrived at Longyearbyen Airport and shaken her hand in the cold outside the terminal, gotten into the Statsbike truck, and listened to her brief me on the crack with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times. She had already been standing at that wall for 91 minutes at a stretch before I ever set foot on Svalbard. Every single thing she had told me. The smell was condensation. The inner chambers were safe. Oslo didn't need to be involved. This was a structural problem and a bureaucratic concern about headlines. All of it had come from someone the organism had already been working on. I had no way to know which parts of my understanding of this situation were accurate and which parts were the shape the organism needed my understanding to take. I had built my entire picture of this vault on information from a compromised source, and I had no instrument for separating what was true from what had been handed to me. And now she was walking toward the crack in the wall. Not toward me, away from me, toward it. I stepped back from the door, one step, then another. My shoulder hit the airlock panel, not hard, I wasn't moving fast, and I turned and looked at it. The panel I had looked at a dozen times during the inspection and registered as background infrastructure. Red handle on the left, keypad below it, lever on the right, currently horizontal. Catherine had walked me through the sequence on the first day with the tone of someone explaining where the fire extinguisher was. Almost a joke, she'd said. You'd have to be trying to trigger it by accident. Red handle, code 7741, lever 180 degrees. Stats big engineering team. 6 weeks minimum to cut through from the outside. I had filed it as background information. I stood in the airlock and looked at the panel, and I understood that I had been given that sequence by the same person who had spent 91 minutes standing motionless in front of a permafrost crack. I had no way to know if she had walked me through it deliberately. I had no way to know if anything about that first day was what it had appeared to be. I had no way to know almost anything, and Catherine was in the inner chamber without a mask, walking toward the wall. And I was standing in the airlock with the panel in front of me and the sequence in my head and no framework left that told me waiting was the right answer. I looked back through the door window one more time. She was at the wall now, standing close to it. Her head was slightly tilted like she was listening. I looked at the red handle. The red handle was cold even through the glove. Then I pulled it and the glove was gone. I don't know exactly when, somewhere in the sequence it just wasn't there anymore. And the handle was cold against my palm, and I held it anyway. 7, 7, 4, 1. I had to think about it. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to explain this part. I had been given that sequence once, in passing, 48 hours before, by someone who was already not entirely herself. And I had to stand there in front of that keypad and actually think. The 4 digits were in my head somewhere. They surfaced the way things do when you're calm in a way that isn't really calm, more like the part of your brain that's still running on procedure because the rest of it has gone quiet. 7, 7, 4, 1. I typed them. The keypad beeped once, soft and clinical, like a hospital monitor confirming a reading. Then the lever. I put both hands on it because it was stiff. Not stuck, just resistant. The kind of mechanical resistance that tells you a thing hasn't been turned in a long time. I rotated it 180 degrees and it moved in increments, each one giving slightly more than the last. And then it reached the end of its arc and stopped. The thump came up through the floor and into my chest. Not loud. That's what I remember. How quiet it was. I had expected something industrial, something that sounded like consequence. What I got was a single low sound, felt more than heard, and then the airlock was just still. The kind of still that means something has been decided. I stood there for a moment. Maybe longer than a moment. I was looking at the panel, the handle now in the down position, the lever horizontal, the keypad dark. And I was aware that somewhere behind several feet of sealed steel and bedrock, Catherine was standing at a wall. I didn't think about her in that moment. Or I did, but not in a way I can explain cleanly. What I thought was, the notebook, 12 pages, the same sentence, over and over, the handwriting falling apart as it went. It was here before the seeds. I thought about the 40 minutes, the 63 minutes, the 91 minutes. I thought about her voice on the voicemail. that flat, effect-free tone reading coordinates to a point 200 meters below solid bedrock at 1:47 in the morning. And I thought about how she had sounded exactly like that when she turned around in the inner chamber and looked at me through the door. No different, no distress, just the coordinates and then the wall. I don't know if that made it easier. I'm not sure I want it to have made it easier. I walked out. The outer tunnel is about 150 meters from the airlock to the entrance, give or take. I know that because I had walked it 4 times in 2 days, and I had clocked it in my head the way you do when you're doing systematic work in an unfamiliar space. You build a map, you know your distances, you keep track of where you are relative to where you need to be. That's just habit. That's just how the job works. I walked it in the dark. The emergency lighting was on, the low amber strips along the floor, and my footsteps sounded very loud and very singular. No other sound. Whatever the vault's ventilation system normally did, it had gone quiet with the seal. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice when a refrigerator you've stopped hearing suddenly turns off. The absence of something you didn't know was there. I came out of the mountain at something close to 3 in the morning. The cold was immediate, not gradual. Immediate the way it always is in the Arctic when you step from inside to outside, like the air itself has edges. Minus 23, I found out later. At the time, I just knew it was the kind of cold that takes your breath and gives it back to you smaller, and I stood at the entrance to Plateauberget for a few seconds, doing the involuntary thing your body does when it's deciding whether it can handle what's happening. It was only then I looked at my right hand. 2 fingers, the index and the middle, had gone white. Not pale, white and waxy looking. The skin tight and slightly shiny in the low ambient light coming off the snow. I knew what that was. You do a single field safety course in cold weather environments and they show you photographs. And the photographs are not subtle. And you don't forget them. Frostbite. The tissue kind, not the surface kind. The kind where the cells have already started doing what cells do when they freeze. And the clinical literature on reversal is not encouraging. I had dropped both gloves at some point during the sequence. I genuinely cannot tell you when. I have tried to reconstruct it and I can't. The gloves are just absent from the memory, the way peripheral details go when you're focused on something with your whole attention. At some point I had been holding a cold metal handle with a bare hand and I had not noticed. And then I had been outside for however long I had been standing there, and now 2 fingers on my right hand were white and waxy and completely numb. I put the hand inside my jacket against my chest and started walking. The lights of Longyearbyen are visible from Plateauberget on a clear night. Not many. It's a small town, a few thousand people at most, the kind of place where the word town is doing some work. But enough. Yellow and white, spread out along the valley floor below the mountain. And I walked toward them because they were the only thing to walk toward. The numbness spread up my hand as I walked. I was aware of it in an abstract way, the way you're aware of things when you're doing the arithmetic on something larger. I was thinking about the seed samples, 1,340,000 of them from every agricultural crop humanity had spent 10,000 years cultivating. Wheat, rice, maize, sorghum, varieties of things that don't exist anywhere else in the world, backup copies of food systems that feed billions of people, all of it behind a seal that would take stats big engineers a minimum of 6 weeks to cut through. Whether the fungal growth had reached the sample containers in that time, whether the structural integrity of the packaging had been compromised, whether spores had gotten into the sealed units, no one would know until someone got back in there. That was just true. I had sealed the question in along with everything else. I had been too deferential. That's the plain version of it. I had been given a reason to call Oslo on day 2, and I had let Catherine talk me out of it. And I had read her institutional anxiety as bureaucratic self-protection, because that was the more comfortable interpretation. And 40 hours of comfortable interpretation had left me with no option, except the one that locked everything inside. If I had called Oslo when I'd mapped the coordinates, If I had pushed past Catherine's certainty and brought in Matthews and Salinas 2 days earlier, maybe there was a version of this where someone with more expertise than me made a more surgical decision. Maybe there wasn't. I don't know. I know I didn't give anyone the chance. The lights got closer. My feet were fine. Good boots, proper layering. The cold weather kit I'd packed because the briefing notes had said to. Just the hand. Just the 2 fingers. I thought about Catherine saying you'd have to be trying to trigger the seal by accident. The way she'd said it, that dry, almost amused tone. The tone of someone showing a visitor around a place they know better than anyone. I had taken her at face value then, too. I had taken everything at face value. I don't know if she told me the sequence deliberately. I have thought about it a lot, and I cannot resolve it. Maybe she did. Maybe some part of her that was still Catherine, still the person who had managed that vault for 3 years and understood what it held and what it meant, had walked me through those steps on the first day because she already knew at some level what was coming. Maybe the organism was already shaping her by then and the sequence was just information it wanted me to have. I can't tell those 2 things apart from the outside, and I'm not sure it matters, and I'm not sure it doesn't. She was in there. Contained, or not contained in a way that had language for it. Alive. Or not alive in any sense I knew how to use the word. I reached the edge of town, and I didn't look back at the mountain. The nearest lit building was a hotel, not the Radisson, a smaller place, one of the guest houses that caters to researchers and seasonal workers, the kind with a common room and a coffee machine that runs all night because the people staying there keep strange hours. There was a light on inside. I could see it through the window. I stood outside the door for a moment, with my right hand still tucked against my chest, and thought about what I was going to say. There was no version of it that started cleanly. There was no sentence I could open with that didn't immediately require 3 other sentences to explain. And those sentences required context I wasn't sure I had the right words for. And the context required someone on the other end of it who was prepared to hear that the Svalbard Global Seed Vault was sealed, and the supervisor was inside, and the thing responsible for that was 40,000 years old and had never been studied in a mammalian host. I opened the door anyway. The warmth hit first. That particular indoor warmth that feels almost aggressive after serious cold. The kind that makes your face sting. A man at the front desk looked up. 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. The expression of someone interrupted in the middle of something routine. I need to make some calls, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. And I need someone to look at my hand. He looked at the hand, then at my face, then back at the hand. Sit down, he said, already moving. I sat down. I found the words, or the beginning of them. Outside, Plateauberget Mountain sat quiet in the polar dark, and inside it, behind a seal that would hold for 6 weeks minimum, 1,340,000 seeds waited in the cold. The same cold that had kept something else waiting, much longer, before the seeds had ever arrived. The coffee machine ran. I started talking.